In this screencast, I want to show you how to use the pen tool in order to create a path around an object in Photoshop, which you can then transform into a selection, which you can use as a layer mask. So this is a multi-step process. The pen tool is one of the more difficult tools to learn if you're new to using it, but this is certainly something that anybody can do. It does take a little bit of practice, but it's really worthwhile learning because the pen tool will give you the most accurate selection that you can create, especially if you're working with a really fine edge, like a hard edge, to separate something from the background or to select something that has a lot of contrast between the object and what it is that it's set on. So I'm using two images here. I'm using this balloon image that I took from the Library of Congress, and I'm using a sky that's in the background. So you can see that I've set my document up with the sky kind of in the background, and then I have a balloon layer where I've just taken a very quick marquee tool selection, something like this around the balloon and copied and pasted it into my document. I did a quick image, auto tone, auto contrast, auto color on it to transform it from that very harsh purple to kind of more grayscale image. So I'm going to toss my balloon document because I'm basically just going to work here. And what I'd like to show you before I get started is how the pen tool works. So the pen tool is located down here on your tool panel. If you click and hold your mouse over the pen tool, you have a bunch of tools that are grouped together with the pen tool, and these will probably come in handy later on. So we'll start with just the pen tool, and then you may later in your practice be using freeform or add anchor point or delete anchor point. We will use the convert point tool at some point in this screencast. The pen tool is not a tool that you use to click and drag and draw with. In fact, if you click and drag, you'll see that all I get is one anchor point with this handle that's moving around like crazy as I'm dragging. So don't be fooled by the name pen tool. It really should be called the plot anchor point tool because that's essentially what you're going to be doing. Now you can see if I wanted to select the balloon away from the background and mask out the background, you could try using something like the lasso tool. And the lasso tool, that's your freeform tool if you wanted to click and drag around the balloon. And you can see with my very, very quick and rough sketch, you could make a selection around the balloon, but by no means will that be accurate or will that give you a decent shot at masking the balloon. You could also try, if you click and hold your mouse down, you could try the magnetic lasso, and I'll zoom in once. The magnetic lasso actually will give you an okay selection. If I go a little more slowly and trace around the balloon, I'll get an okay selection. It's not great, it's not perfect, it doesn't really pick up all of the details, but if I were in a real hurry, that would work. I'm missing a couple of parts, right? So once I make my selection, ultimately I'm going to go over here and apply a layer mask. And so you can see I'd be missing a couple parts of the balloon. I could probably get those back with my layer mask. So if you really want to avoid the pen tool entirely, you could try the magnetic lasso. I usually feel like the magnetic lasso never quite gives me exactly what I want, and so I don't even waste my time with it. I just go straight to the pen tool. The pen tool is used ultimately to plot anchor points, and when you pick up the pen tool, the first thing you want to look at is, am I making a path or a shape? If you're using the pen tool in order to create a selection, which you will then use to convert to a mask, you want to use the pen tool as a path. So I'm going to pick up the pen tool, make sure that my settings in the top bar are set to path. And then all you're going to do is plot anchor points going around the balloon. Now that sounds maybe a little easier than it will be when you actually go to do this for the first time. So in my file, I've also created a layer called anchor points that I'm going to use just to show you where I'm going to set my anchor points in order to make my path around the balloon. You can see that when we have kind of big areas where the line, the sort of outline of the balloon doesn't change too much, we will use fewer anchor points. In fact, the fewer anchor points you use, the better your path is going to be. The smoother your path will be, the less kind of bumpy it will be. And we want that really smooth contour going around the object. So it's only going to take a few anchor points to kind of get up and around the balloon. Well, it'll take 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 anchor points to do kind of this whole big area. Now down here, it's going to take a few more. Anytime you change direction, you need an anchor point. And so you can see on a curve like this, a small curve, I'm going to have to put an anchor point there and then go up to the curve and then back down. And anytime in here, what I'm doing is I'm going to zoom in so you can see, I'm kind of going around some of these like slightly curved areas. And I'll do this in a couple of ways when we go and plot our points. I'll plot them as hard edges and then I'll plot them as curves, and you can see the difference when I finish. Here I'm going to plot them as hard edges. So just to give you kind of a quick glance, with the pen tool, all you'll do is you'll plot anchor points. So I'm just going to do something out here. I'm going to click once. There's my first anchor point. I'm going to come over here and click again. There's my next anchor point. I'm going to come down here and click again for my next anchor point. This is just a test, just to show the pen tool. And then I always want to close my path. And I can Command Z to undo that last accidental click. So I always want to click on my first point to close the path. So my first and last point should be the same. And when the path is closed, you're basically just going to see a full path with your pen tool kind of is isolated as its own tool, and the path is closed. If I look in my paths panel, you can see what your work path looks like, and you can double click work path and name this. So this is just a triangle that I will never use, but just to show it, if you click off of your path is hidden. If you click on it, so on my triangle that I've named, it appears. If you click on your path, and you can use now, over here I have my path selection if I wanted to click and drag my path around. I have my direct selection tool, which is similar to the direct selection tool in Illustrator. And I'm going to click off of my path, and then I'm going to click right on one of the corners. And I can click and modify my path by pulling one of the anchor points with the direct selection tool. So my paths, my pen tool and my path tool and my path selection and my direct selection tools, they all work very similarly to the way that they work in Illustrator. So if you're familiar with these tools from Illustrator, you'll have an easier time working with them here in Photoshop. And vice versa. If you learn these tools in Photoshop, it translates very easily into using them in Illustrator. So right now I have basically a triangular path around this top corner of the image. That's not really anything that I want to use right now, but just so I can sort of show it. What we're ultimately going to do is we'll make a path around the balloon, and then with our path in place, we will make a selection. I'm not going to feather it at all. Feathering would just give me a soft edge, but I'm going to leave my hard edge. And then in our layer panel, we'll go ahead and we'll create a layer mask on the layer that has the selection active. So if I just had a triangle selected, my layer mask would give me a mask that shows that triangle. Now Command Z will undo my last step. Select deselect, or Command D will deselect my selection. In my paths panel, as long as I'm not selecting my triangle, if I'm basically clicking off of it, I won't see it. So now I'm kind of back to square one and I'm ready to go. It really doesn't matter what layer I have activated when I go ahead and create my path, because the path is going to live on its own path in the paths panel. But I'll keep my balloon layer selected or active for now anyhow, because that's the layer that I want to work with. It's best to zoom in and work kind of close up on the image as you're creating your path. And then as you're working with the pen tool, the space bar will access the hand tool, and that will allow me to kind of move the document around as I'm working. So I'm going to start right from here, and I'll work my way around the balloon. I'm working with just the regular pen tool, not the freeform pen or not any of these others. and I've got it set on path. So I'm ready to go. I'm going to start here. I'm just going to click once to set my first anchor point. And then I'm going to come up here. Now, this is actually a little bit of a curve. This is not a straight line. So anytime you have, even if it's just a slight curve, when you click your anchor point, what you want to do is you want to click and drag. And I'm going to drag a little bit, and you'll see as I'm dragging, I'm creating what are called Bezier handles. And these handles sort of dictate where the path will next go. So and you'll notice as I clicked and dragged, my path kind of scooted up a little bit to match the curve of the balloon. And my handle, this handle over here, is pointing in the direction of where the path is going to go when I make my next click. And so I'll come here and I'll click my next anchor point. And then because it's a curve, I will drag. And notice as I drag again, that path is kind of stretching out to meet the curve of the balloon. And so I'll click here and drag. All of these are curves. I'll hold the space bar and move this into view. And I'll click here and drag. Now the further I drag, the longer these handles are, the softer my curve. And the shorter I drag, the shorter those handlebars, and the more likely I am to get a little bit of a bump or even a kind of a sharp edge in that what should be a curve. So I want to make sure that these handles are have a little bit of distance so that I have a kind of a softer curve. I'll let go of the mouse, come here and click and drag. And down here and click and drag. Okay, that's pretty decent. I can sort of manipulate my path after the fact. So I'm just going to get it close. I'm not going to worry about being really, really precise. I can come back and sort of tweak this afterwards. Now, I've come to an interesting place. Here, I have a corner. So I have a curve that kind of comes into this spot, and then I have a straight line that shoots out of the spot. So I see this anchor, or this point right here, as a little bit of kind of a corner piece. So you'll notice if I would go here, look at where my anchor point is, where my path rather is pointing, where my handle is pointing. If I'm going to go here, my path is going to go in the direction of where that handle is pointing. And even if I drag, I'm dragging in the direction of where the handle is pointing, which is not at all conforming to the shape of my balloon. So I'll Command Z to undo that. What I need to do, because this is a corner and because I'm going to go in a really different direction than this, is I need to hold my Option key. Notice what happens to my pen tool. I'm going to put my pen tool right on that anchor point. I'm going to hold the Option, and I see that my pen tool transforms into a Convert Anchor Point tool. So I'm going to click right on that anchor point, and now that handle disappears. And as I click over here, I'm just going to click, I'm not going to drag. I'm going to get a straight line. So that gives me a way to sort of change directions while I'm working with my pen tool. Now I'm going to come up here and click and drag because this is a curve, and down there and click and drag a little bit. I could actually, Command Z, I could actually just come down there and click. I drag just a little bit because it is a little bit curved here. And again, my handle's pointing in this direction. I want to go over in this direction, so I need to Option click on that anchor point so that I can change directions and come here and click and drag a little bit. So I'll click and drag here. I'm going to hold spacebar Command to zoom in. On a PC, spacebar Control. And then here I'm just going to click and drag just a tiny bit. Click and drag just a tiny bit. This is just giving me kind of a little bit of a curve going around these outer parts of the balloon. Okay, notice this last one, I kind of have a weird S shape going. I'm going to Command Z, Option click the anchor point, and I'll click and drag here. Probably could have done that for all of these, but you'll notice when we go to make this into a layer mask, but this is a very tiny area. I'm not really too concerned about getting precise in there. I will option click my anchor point here so that I can change directions and get my path to conform to the balloon there. Spacebar to move this out of the way here. Option click on the anchor point there, because look at my handle, it's pointing all the way over here. If I would go click here, I've got kind of the opposite of what I want. So option click on that anchor point, and I'm just going to do the same thing. Option click, click and drag. Option click, click and drag. Option click, click and drag. Okay, so I'm option click right on the anchor point, click and drag. I'll give this a little tiny click and drag. Now here, I'm going to make these straight lines, kind of jagged straight lines, just to show something you can do sort of after the fact. So I'm just going to go ahead and click, and I'm actually going to add one that wasn't there, one anchor point. And I'm almost done. I'm going to click up here. I'm actually going to drag a little bit, click here and drag a little bit to make this a little bit softer and rounder. And then finally meet my first anchor point, right? I always want to start and finish on the same anchor point. And notice my pen tool has a little tiny circle next to it, which gives me sort of the icon for completing the path or making my path whole. So I'm going to click right there on that first one. And now if I zoom out, Command 0 on my keypad to zoom all the way out. If I look in my paths, I've got a work path that goes around the balloon. I'm going to double click work path and call this balloon. I'll go to my layers. I'm going to hide my anchor point, which was just my layer to show you where I was clicking and to remind you if you download the file of where to go. And then I want to just kind of analyze my path. I want to take a look at it and see, how does my path look? It's pretty close. There are places where it deviates a little bit from the balloon. It's mostly pretty close. Here, there's a little bit of deviation over here. So what I can do now is, I'm going to zoom out just so you can see this, and then I'll zoom back in again. I'm going to work with my direct selection tool. My direct selection tool allows me to modify my anchor point. So I'm going to click anywhere on the path. I click off of it and anywhere on it so that I can see all of my anchor points. And if I click an anchor point, I can see it, and I can also see the Bezier handles on any of the anchor points that have been set as curves. So if they've been set as a curve, then I've got a handle, and I can adjust that handle, which will adjust the direction and the flow of the curve. Now, as you adjust one handle, you know, the other one adjusts too. So you have to check out both sides of the curve as you're doing this. So I can click on an anchor point and adjust a handle. That's pretty close. I'm going to leave that as it is. Okay. Down here, I can click an anchor point and actually move it. Now here, this anchor point here feels like my handle got a little out of control. So what I can do is I can move these two little handles in. Got to kind of click it to get it. It's a little hard to see on my file. There we go. Okay, and that's a little bit better, and I'll zoom out again so we can see this a little better. Now over here, I purposefully made these into kind of sharp edges. If I wanted to, I could use from my pen, from my series of pen tools here, different pen tools, I can click on the pen tool and scroll down to the Convert Point tool. And if I use Convert Point, I can click and drag on any anchor point and I can make it into a curve, right? So any place where I have a hard edge, if I click and drag, I can soften it into a curve. And the same thing goes for any curve. If I want to make it into a hard edge, I can use the Convert Anchor Point tool. Usually you'll use the Convert Anchor Point tool and then you'll go back probably with your Direct Selection tool to modify how that curve is going to play out. So I might do this one as well into a little bit of a curve. Okay, once your path is as complete as you want it to be, right? So I feel like this is in pretty good shape. Make sure you've saved it, double click it and give it a name like I already have for balloon. And then with my pen tool selected, I'm going to choose Make Selection. I could also do this over here. I could hold the Command key and click right on this icon to make it a selection. I could use the Make a Selection icon or Load Path as Selection icon in the bottom of the Paths panel. In CS6, you've got Make a Selection up here, only if you're on the pen tool. So however you want to do it, make a selection. I'm going to press OK. And now in my Layers panel, on my balloon layer, I will add a layer mask. If I have a selection on my layer and I add a layer mask, what my layer mask does is it uses that selection to determine what will, how the mask will be defined. So I can see in my mask, and I'm going to option click right on my mask, all of the white areas are the visible parts of the layer, and all of the black areas are the hidden parts of the layer. And I'll option click that again to get back into sort of normal editing mode. I can click on my layer thumbnail and I can click on my layer mask thumbnail. If I'm clicking on my layer thumbnail, I can move this layer around, and I'm moving the layer and the mask because the layer and the mask are linked by default. If I unlink the layer and the mask and I move my layer, what's going to happen is I'm moving basically the contents of the layer around inside a mask that stays in place. So I'm going to Command Z and I'm going to relink my layer to its mask because I would like my mask to stay in place. If there's any place where I've goofed up a little bit, I could use my mask to hide or show parts of my layer. So remember that my mask is just using to hide and show parts of the layer. The whole layer is there. If I shift click that mask, shift click basically just hides the mask, kind of temporarily hides the mask. So I can see my entire layer is there. All of my contents are there. That's why using a layer mask is called non-destructive editing. I'm not deleting pixels. I'm not getting rid of any parts of my layer. I'm just hiding parts of my layer. So if I click on my mask to be working in mask mode, and then let's say I go and get my pencil tool, since this is a very hard edge. If I work with black, remember black is hidden, and I'm going to press the open bracket on my keypad to reduce the size of my brush. So with black, I could just maybe get rid of these little tiny dark points right here. I actually think those are fine in the image, but if you wanted to, you can see if I undo and redo, you can see what I'm doing here, and I'll zoom in once and undo and redo. So all I'm doing on my mask is the pencil just set at 2 little tiny pixels in some black paint. I'm just going in, and I need to zoom way in to see it. I'm just kind of tracing over those darker pixels to eliminate them. And if I look on my mask, it's kind of hard to see, and I think my whole piece just zoomed over, but I'm basically modifying this edge. And option click to view in editing, normal editing mode. Make sure you're not on your layer as you trace around with your dark pencil, because what will happen on my layer, if I'm in areas, I'm actually going to get a dark pencil line. So Command Z to undo that. I want to make sure that I'm on the mask, and then if I want to, I can get rid of some of these just darker pixels. I don't really feel that they're too erroneous, really, but I just want to show kind of modifying the mask. You can also modify the mask, and in this case this is not the best example, but if you wanted to, you could use the brush tool. I'll make my brush a bit larger with the close bracket key. If I look in my brushes, yeah, I'll use a really soft brush. And so just to show this, with a soft brush, I could get a very kind of feathered, maybe blended edge. Now on this balloon, that doesn't really make sense unless maybe I wanted to pretend I'll make a really big brush that like it's sort of moving into the clouds and we can't see it, you know, something like that. So maybe in that case it makes sense to have a soft feathered edge. I don't really mean to do that right now, but that's all right. I'll leave that as is. That's fine. And if I look on my mask, I can see that that softness is basically a gradient. So when I have a gradient on my mask from black to white with some, you know, various shades of gray between black and white, what that translates to is a kind of blended layer. And it blends between the layer and whatever's beneath it, right? So I have this sort of transparency that fades out. Now on my regular layer, I'm going to go ahead, I always sort of, when I feel like I'm done working with the mask, I always click over to the layer thumbnail just to sort of set myself back to what I consider to be sort of normal editing mode. I'm going to go ahead and create one new layer, and I'm going to use my eyedropper tool to pick up kind of a blue, one of the blues from the sky. And I'm going to use the hotkey Option Delete. Option Delete will fill with my foreground color. Command Z. Alternatively, on that new layer, I could just choose Edit Fill, and I could fill with my foreground color. I like to use the hotkeys, so Option Delete. I'm going to call this layer blue, and I'm going to set it to color blending mode. Now that blue cast is covering everything in the document. So I'm going to go ahead and use my Option key to clip that blue color cast down to just my balloon. Notice that it's now only affecting my balloon. And with my opacity slider, I'm going to kind of back off on this a little bit. I'm going to set it maybe to 45%. So if I hide and show that blue, I'm just giving my balloon a little bit of a cooler color cast so that it blends a little bit more effectively with the sky. Okay. Now one last thing, I feel like I'm done, so I'm going to go ahead and just choose File, Save As, and I'll choose Sky and Balloon. Whoops. Final. One last thing that you should know, the paths panel is going to save your path, right? So you've got your path there if you need to use it later. In your layer panel, a lot of times I see, especially maybe students who are new to working with layer masks, adding additional layer masks on the same layer. Like I see this all the time where I have like a couple of layer masks. You really only need one layer mask on your layer. So if you've accidentally pressed the button twice, you can click on a mask and drag it to the trash to delete it. My extra mask there is called the vector mask. If I click on this layer mask and drag it to the trash, notice that I can apply my mask before removing it, or just delete it altogether. If I apply it, what happens is now my balloon layer only has the pixels defined by the mask. So I've basically thrown away those extra pixels. There are some instances where you may want to do that. I would say in most cases you probably don't want to do that. I'm going to go back to my history and just come back here to the step before I've deleted my mask. Okay, I want to see my mask there. Okay, so I'm going to stop here. I'm going to put these files up on my website so anyone watching YouTube can try to play along with this if you'd like. And for students in my class, of course, you'll have access to these files as well. I encourage you to practice working with the pen tool. It is not the easiest tool to learn because you really have to sort of predict where its next step is going to go. You know, as you plot these anchor points, in your mind you have to know where the path will be drawn, and that does take a little bit of knowledge of working with the tool and some anticipation. So practice makes perfect. Use the tool a lot, and you'll get very good at understanding how it works and where these anchor points, you know, how the path will build as you plot the anchor